Hello and welcome back to the Sekimeiya Spun. I'm still a little bit ill, so apologies if my voice sometimes sounds a bit off. Sai finished summarizing what had happened, avoiding explicit words that would have hurt Erina even more. It was way too much to take in, and it revealed that we'd slept for longer than we'd thought. As I looked at Erina, who hadn't raised her head since we'd entered, I saw the wet stains on her lap that I'd missed before. Shira looked crushed. She couldn't believe such a sudden and tragic story had unfolded while she'd slept. I began to feel guilty about my recent actions, ones I'd taken in ignorance. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, repelling the thought that Isla was really no longer with us. I felt terrible for her and Erina, but also unimaginably pissed off. Instead of having the chance to mourn privately, Erina had to spend hours locked up with us, not understanding how or why her daughter had passed away. It was a bad idea, but I asked it regardless in a quiet voice. "Can I go see?" Sai nodded hesitantly, as it wasn't his decision. Shirya must have been horrified at the thought of seeing Isla with her own eyes. I didn't want to see her either, but I wanted to understand what had happened more than anything. It was the least we could do. I didn't know how to act, only that attempting to comfort Erina was foolish. We told her how sorry we were as soon as Sai had mentioned Isla's death, but that had been it. Before I could move, Erina stood up and looked at us. Although she didn't have the strength to speak, she breathed while wiping her face and walked toward hallway A. She needed to know what had occurred. Many things were strange, starting with Isla's behavior. She had gone to that cabinet by herself without explaining why, so there must have been something important there. Then her yell upon seeing its contents. Given how Erina had found the cabinet empty, it seemed possible to conclude that what Isla had witnessed. And even though the Sekimeiya had been in the cleaning room, there was a chance the two existed. If Isla's disappearance had been caused by the Sekimeiya, it was possible that she had seen a human body. Her own, perhaps. It would have warranted the scream, and humans were all that the Sekimeiya seemed to make travel. Maybe it had been someone in the cabinet and they disappeared at the same time as Isla. What do you mean humans were all that the Sekimeiya seemed to make travel? What about the cleaning cart from literally last episode? I don't know if it was last episode, it might have been 2 or 3 ago, but you know what I mean. However, I kept in mind what Shiryu and I had just discussed. If falling into the cabinet had made Isla touch what had been inside, she might have traveled with it if it had become something she possessed, for lack of a better term. And if that was what had happened, the source of the range must have been outside the cabinet, or else the Sekimeiya would have remained inside it. If the range had come from the Sekimeiya in the cleaning room, Erina by the entrance to room A5 should have traveled as well. Given how Sai and Akira had seen Isla falling into the cabinet, Kate, who had just disappeared, could have been who'd activated it. In that case, nobody would have noticed he'd traveled too, as he'd been believed to have disappeared prior. However, the crystal floor had just been searched, so if Kate's range had encompassed the whole cabinet, it might have come from floor 2. If the range went through solid objects, it could have come from the ceiling if Kate had been above the room. In fact, my foot travel suggested that the range could go through solid objects. The Sekimeiya had been in the cleaning cart and had been picked up too, so if the Sekimeiya was the nucleus of the range, the cart's walls should have prevented me from traveling. After Isla's disappearance, the group had searched through the whole building and hadn't found Kate. If he'd activated the travel from floor 2, he could have appeared on the crystal floor, escaping the search. However, it was important to note that they hadn't found me and Shirya, so their search hadn't been perfect. Damn noobs. That theory explained Kate's and Isla's disappearances along with the lack of the Sekimeiya in the cabinet. Would it mean that it had all just been a very unfortunate coincidence though? Isla had found something peculiar about the cabinet, and there had been something frightening inside it. We were all in front of it. Since nobody else was going to step in, I walked forward myself. I was afraid and worried about how Isla would look, but I needed to find something that hinted at what had happened. I began raising the lid while everyone kept their eyes slightly diverted from me. It's gonna be empty, isn't it? I carefully leaned it on the wall so that it wouldn't close again. Then I finally looked inside, hoping that the dim light would prevent the sight from being too harsh. Oh, wait. This isn't what you said? What isn't? Sai, thinking that I'd accused him of lying, walked forward while everyone adopted a slight frown. As soon as he looked, he understood what I'd meant. Huh? I don't get it. Why is this? The others all got closer. He saw Isla resting face up with her knees folded. However, my own little wish had been denied by the Sekimeiya which was beside her, emitting a faint light that illuminated her more than I'd wanted. Now, the thing is, I would believe that this cabinet was dark enough so that a not glowing Sekimeiya, sort of in its, sleeping state, would not have been noticed. Then again, they did kind of check her pulse, didn't they? I feel like if you lean in and check that, you would see it anyway, but, well, maybe you'd overlook it. I mean, it probably wouldn't be your focus. Well, it shouldn't be here. I haven't gone to the cleaning room myself, but I'm certain that when I saw her, there was nothing else here. I didn't find it appropriate to blame them for having left the Sekimeiya out of the cabinet since Isla had disappeared, but none of us could have moved it. Yeah, I'm sure the Sekimeiya wasn't here when we left. Erina, who had been the only one to refrain from looking, gave a small nod when her eyes met. There's no way it got here by itself. Kate left the room as he gestured at us to follow. Naturally, he was going to the cleaning room, so Shiro and I instinctively looked at each other, knowing how that would end. Oh, what the? Oh, right, you said the cleaning cart had disappeared after our travel. This is too much. Does it simply not exist anymore? We'd hidden the Sekimeiya, but admitting it was pointless, as that had nothing to do with Isla's death and would only make us extremely suspicious. I made sure to communicate my stance on it to Shiro by appearing to be surprised. It's not here. We left the Sekimeiya in this bucket. What, then, did it teleport to Isla? Listen, Atsuki, I don't want to throw out useless accusations right now, but you understand that you and Shiro are the only two people who could have moved it, right? That's not true. Someone who came from the future could have done it too. You're right, but assuming that didn't happen, it could only have been you two. Kate could have taken it as well, but he couldn't have left it in the cabinet. This is the first time you've seen the cleaning cart gone, right? You came to the lobby from hallway B, so did you not explore these rooms? Why did you go straight to the lobby? Because we heard voices. And I actually don't think we did. I actually thought I think they were quiet. Anyway, understand that what you've told us is that you two spent all the time in the attic sleeping. Despite this, you weren't found. You didn't find Kate either, so you obviously didn't do a great job. And you were in a rush, so you kept yelling Isla's name while quickly looking. I bet you didn't look at the upper levels of the bedrooms, which is where we were, and since we were asleep, we didn't hear you. And yes, we found it unlikely you'd be in a crystal room, so our first instinct was to go to the event room and then to the lobby. Forgive me, but I find this hard to believe. You came from hallway B, which is unneeded for what you're saying. In fact, since you knew the Sekimeiya had been in the cleaning room, what I find most believable is that you came here straight away. We didn't. We just had to go to the bathroom after sleeping, so we took hallway B afterward. Both of you? Yes, does that matter? If I'm not misremembering, there's a corpse covering the entire floor of the men's. Did not bother you? Don't be stupid, I used the other one too. I'd admittedly missed that, but Sai stopped talking as it had started to feel very disrespectful. I wasn't sure if he was accusing us of hiding the Sekimeiya or of being involved in Isla's death. I didn't have to say it, but I'd been ready to claim that if we'd hidden it in Isla's cabinet, we would have appeared from hallway A. Well, no matter how, the Sekimeiya moved from here to the cabinet. I don't know why the culprit would do this. Shiro and I had hidden the Sekimeiya in Naomi's locker, so it was even more confusing for us. Nobody could have put it in the cabinet. The goal seemed very hard to decipher, and there was the entire existence of another Sekimeiya to deal with. Something Sai had said bothered me. The culprit. He was implying that what had happened to Isla had a culprit behind it, and one who had orchestrated everything deliberately. I wasn't so convinced about that, so we moved again to where Isla lay to find out about an important fact, the cause of her death. We left the lid uncovered, and as I peeked inside, I saw that the Sekimeiya was still present. It was white and it emitted a bit of light around itself. I covered my hand with my sleeve and reached in to grab it. I underestimated the depth of the cabinet, and my fingers brushed the Sekimeiya, causing it to roll and contact Isla's face. Frowning, I retrieved it properly and stood up straight. Remember what we thought about Naomi? That perhaps the Sekimeiya had replicated her dead body? Well, I accidentally knocked it into Isla's cheek, and given how the Sekimeiya is still white and I wasn't picked up by any range, it's unlikely anything happened. Is it hot? Slightly, yes. Really, it was almost hot enough to hurt, but I didn't feel like indulging Sai. Since I didn't know what to do with it, I made my way to the event room and put it in the cabinet. I explored the possibility of activating it myself, but I discarded it quickly, as it was clear that we didn't truly know how it worked, and the death that seemed to have been closely tied to its mechanics had just taken place. Going back, I met Kate in the hallway. I went to grab this from the security room. It's a little flashlight I use to move around this floor when the lights are off. It should be helpful. I see, it will. Once I returned, I showed the light to Erina, letting her know that it would help us look at Isla and the cabinet. Erina, are you opposed to this? If you prefer, we can wait until the police investigate. I would like to see if anything's to be found and to learn what happened, but I'd understand if you wanted us to hold off. No, go ahead. Okay. At least it was good to see that she didn't strongly suspect us of being responsible, even though it seemed that only Shira and I could have had the chance to move the Sekimeiya. Based on the story that Sai had told us, it should have been possible for Sai, Akuro and Kate to be working together and have put the Sekimeiya there themselves, but it was a very unlikely thought. I stepped forward again. My intention was not to touch Isla directly, and even though I'd appreciated the lack of proper illumination earlier, I was about to use a light myself. I felt very uneasy, but the dark scenery might have been preventing us from seeing something important. As soon as I turned it on, the flashlight proved to be very strong. I illuminated the entire room, and for the first time we clearly saw what the walls and ceiling had turned into. They could almost be called disfigured, but at first glance nothing else stood out. I moved to the cabinet, and aside from Erina, who remained by the door, the rest got closer too. I could clearly see Isla's hauntingly peaceful face. Bearing such a sight was too overwhelming, and for an instant I thought I'd suddenly wake up back in the attic. However, apart from that, the result wasn't what I'd expected. The darkness wasn't concealing anything from us. In fact, the interior of the cabinet was exactly as it had appeared. Not a single drop of blood had stained it, and nothing hinted at the way Isla had lost her life. For the first time, and with a slight frown, I reached my hand out to touch her. However, any doubts I had were wiped away by the lifeless skin that made contact with mine. Even though nothing indicated how it had happened, Isla was not alive. How had the leap from life to death happened? I had no good guess. I spoke in a faint voice so that Erina wouldn't hear me. 2 weeks prior, a death had destroyed my life, but that was absolutely minuscule compared to how Erina must have felt. If I had any answers for her, they needed to be certain. I can't know what happened to her just by looking, but there's no blood at all. It reminds me a bit of the second Naomi. So, physical damage wasn't the cause. Unless brain damage from a blow didn't leave a wound, it could have been poisoning. You think someone had the chance to poison her in a situation like this? I'm just keeping my options open. I don't know. If someone did this to her, sure, but in terms of natural deaths, not many things would apply, as the common ones such as sudden heart failures are extremely rare for children. Sekimeiya was in some way involved, so we have to think about more out of the ordinary causes. Yeah, what if traveling is what caused this to begin with? When she disappeared, she must have traveled through time and appeared somewhere else. If at that point she couldn't have existed, it's possible she appeared in this state. Even though she reminds me of the second Naomi, that body had a wound in the head. I can't see any such thing here though. What other causes would result in this kind of state? Starvation, for example? Well, she would have died of dehydration before starvation, and that has effects on the skin. I gently pinched Isla's cheek, lightly pulled it, and then released it. If someone is dehydrated, their skin isn't very elastic. I don't see anything indicating it here. It looks normal. Also, she'd have to have spent a pretty long time in here, definitely more than a day. What about asphyxiation? A culprit would have it easy if their victim was a child, but there are no marks on her neck. Oh, I meant asphyxiation within the cabinet. It doesn't seem like a big space, so could that have happened? I doubt it. It's true that something was up with this cabinet, but that would require her to spend a long time inside, and there's no reason why she wouldn't have left. It's much less time than dehydration, but it's still considerable. Let's say that she couldn't escape though. The way she'd die would be from carbon dioxide intoxication, not from lack of oxygen. Even in such a small space though, I think it would take 6 or 7 hours. Maybe even more since a child would breathe less. It was much less than 7 hours ago when we looked through this room and cabinets. Right. The way this happened, we can't tell if it was a homicide or an accident caused by the Sekimeiya. She most likely traveled to the past, but even if she spent that time in the cabinet, it wouldn't have been enough to kill her. And since Erina wasn't picked up by the travel, it's likely she didn't go very far back. There was another reason why I believed something like that might have happened, and it was Isla's yell. If she traveled to the past and had spent time in the cabinet, it meant that what had made Isla scream had been seeing her own body. Yes. However, that same travel would have made 2 bodies travel back, multiplying the number every time. That couldn't be right, and it also meant that the body she'd seen must have been alive. Fair point? Yes. Actually true. Because the cabinet was empty for like a little bit afterwards, wasn't it? So she definitely did go back in time and made it I don't know how she reappeared in the cabinet afterwards, but I mean, I figured that at some point during the time where and Atsuki was, what's his name, Atsuki? I think so, yeah. Was talking about Naomi and her second body and stuff like that, where you can't travel or you can't teleport a dead body apparently. So she must have been alive at some point. Well, whatever. What I just said played in my mind. 6 or 7 hours would have been needed for her to suffocate inside the cabinet. That time could be cut in half if 2 Islas had been in the cabinet, though as they would have breathed twice as much. What about 3 Islas or 4 Islas? Nonetheless, it was completely off the mark. It must have been a bizarre homicide, which was one of the most unnerving thoughts that could come to me. I still have no idea why the Sekimeiya appeared here. You're sure it wasn't here before you left, right? Yes, we checked around her. Then something else happened that put it here. If someone brought it deliberately, it must have been the culprit, needing it for whatever happened. If not, then it means that the Sekimeiya can teleport and travel too. Maybe that's why we didn't find it when Isla disappeared, because the Sekimeiya she traveled with had also teleported. Yes, but if that's it, it would have appeared with Isla's body, not later. We continued looking at her face, slight traces of pain present behind its seeming serenity. A few hot tears stung the corners of my eyes. The peaceful appearance she had was a cruel joke, nothing more. Although I kept trying to reach a conclusion, everything was too broad and strange to decide anything. At my side, Shiraya, not having spoken in a while, hadn't taken her eyes off Isla. Eventually, we turned around. Erina was by the door looking down. I couldn't imagine what her thoughts were, but we let her know the gist of what we determined. She accepted our words with almost imperceptible nods. We didn't know what else to do, but as we were about to leave, she stepped into the room and walked up to Isla again. I wasn't sure why until I saw her staring inside and crying again. We silently watched her, understanding how painful but hard to resist the sight must have been for her. When she was ready, she stood up straight and approached us. We'd only known her for a few hours, but I felt the most sincere sadness for her. Excluding Naomi, Isla was the second death I had had to directly face. If the past 2 weeks hadn't drained me like they had, I probably would have been unable to control my emotions. I recalled the recording that told us Isla would be alive in a month. What to think about it, I had no idea, but it had ironically become a last hope. Could the Sekimeiya have the power to bring a person back to life? It wasn't that ridiculous of a thought depending on how it worked, so making the recording become true at the cost of spending a month in a tower was the best case scenario. If one thing was certain, it was that some kind of plan existed behind it. Out of everyone there, the recorder had appeared inside Isla's purse, and even within it, some words had stood out as strange. In a few hours at 2100, we'd have a much better understanding of its veracity. Although he hadn't checked, it was very likely within that mysterious cabinet still inside Isla's purse. After giving the flashlight back to Kate, he brought it to the security room. Once again, we moved to the lobby due to its proximity to the outside world and how spacious it was. Shiria, Kate, and I sat on a couch. There were chairs next to the reception desk, but everyone else chose to sit on the floor in silence, leaning against a wall. Our most recent incident had shattered every ounce of motivation within me. While it had made me want to know what was going on even more, I only had the energy to think to myself. I was almost sure that two Sekimeiya existed, and that one had been the source of Isla's death. I still held the key to the other one. My intention had been to later check on the Sekimeiya that we had, so I had to eventually decide what to do regarding that. We were all sitting down, letting the time pass and waiting for our release. If I didn't do anything, it was possible the police would find the key on me, giving away that I'd been the one to hide the Sekimeiya. I would have to ditch it before it was too late. I could see Shiria next to me, looking down at the floor. She'd still been trying to accept me as deaf. Naomi's had surely made things worse, and Isla, who had taken a liking to Shiria fairly quickly, was gone too. The best thing I could do for her was let her process it. Unlike 2 weeks ago, we'd seen Isla's dead body, meaning that using the Sekimeiya to prevent her death was probably not doable. Despite that, it could have been useful to understand what had happened if we used it to go to the past. Could the past be changed? There are many different ways the universe could work. If the past could be changed, how would it work? Upon traveling, would the timeline we live in change instantly? If so, the person who traveled would be the only one aware of the change, and everyone else would only have memories of the new timeline. Another way could be that upon traveling and changing the past, a new flow of time is created with the change. In this case, the original one would continue without being affected, and the person who had traveled would stop existing in it altogether. But it doesn't seem like the Sekimeiya allows for either one. We travel to the past, to the very same timeline, and don't change anything. Yet the travelers do allow for occurrences to happen that we'd already experienced before traveling. It's impossible to feel sure about this, but hours ago I tried to save Naomi. As soon as I became determined to change the past, and when it seemed possible, the universe put a barrier in front of me and made everything occur as it had. That's still kind of like the dumbest reasoning in the whole game to me so far. Like, what are you talking about? Even though when I ran to the bathroom it might have already been too late to save Naomi, I had decided not to let the culprit escape. Even that was seamlessly denied too. We'd kept the Sekimeiya we'd last travelled with inside Naomi's locker. If we were right and the longer it spent away from the cold the further we'd go, we might have been able to use it to go more than 2 weeks into the past. I knew nothing good would come from that, but at least seeing Mia again was a vague possibility. However, when we'd hidden the Sekimeiya, it hadn't appeared to work, so to use it again we had to hope it would start working eventually. To go back far enough, the time travelled couldn't be less than or equal to the time stored, but I didn't think that was the case. If keeping the Sekimeiya out of the cabinet for 20 minutes resulted in a 20-minute travel, we couldn't go so far back. If, for example, a minute stored resulted in a 30-minute travel, it could become possible, but it wouldn't correspond to my travels. I thought about something. Why had the Sekimeiya not worked when we'd put it in the locker? Could the universe have prevented it from working? What if after traveling we would have been guaranteed to change what had already occurred? Maybe when a travel was going to lead into an impossibility, the Sekimeiya wouldn't allow it to begin with. That sounds stupid, but okay, I'll hear you out. One more time a thought led me back to the recorder that informed us we'd spend my and Shiria's birthdays in the tower. If it came true, we could possibly store the Sekimeiya for 30 days, granting a very far travel. We'd found the recorder in our presence, so a clear implication was that someone had traveled from the future to bring it to us. It had appeared inside Isla's purse, but she couldn't have been the one to travel since she had died. Strangely though, the recording also seemed to prove that she would be alive in a month, and to top it off, Sai and Akro had sounded very surprised to see her. I got a bit dizzy. Just what was the reality of it all? It had to be related to Isla's mysterious friend. Someone in that silent room with me could have had the intention to trap us for an entire month. Potentially so that they could achieve a very far travel. As I thought of it, I realized more and more how important it was to fully understand the Sekimeiya. That is actually a good point of like an ultimate goal to have, like an end goal for the culprit in quotation marks. Because so far, all of the possible goals that, Atsuki and everyone thought of were kind of, not really that logical, in a sense that, stealing stuff was like, well, I mean, doesn't really matter how long there's, locked in there and stuff like that. But trying to kind of load up the Sekimeiya, kind of charge it up and enable the culprit to go back to the past very, very far is actually a solid reason. We don't know how the Sekimeiya works, and at this point, we can't be sure the culprit does either. Because, you could say, well, obviously the culprit must know how it works to kind of keep getting out of our way, but I mean, so has everyone else who traveled with the Sekimeiya, except possibly the second Sai, which it's still a bit fuzzy on what on earth was going on there. But Atsuki never got found by anyone, and he has no fucking idea how the Sekimeiya works. So we don't know if the culprit has 100% understanding of how it works. Maybe more than us, sure, but we can't guarantee it. We obviously need to consider it, but while the person responsible had to be around us, it was possible they hadn't thought of it yet. Since Erina and Shiraya had heard the recording, I found it unlikely either of them would be the one to eventually cause that outcome, as their idea of staying for one more month would have originally come from having heard the recording, just like how I'd thought of some of its benefits only because the idea had been presented to me. While such a causal loop couldn't be completely ruled out, it sounded irrational. The interesting part about that is, why would all of this have happened in the first place if the idea of traveling back very far with the Sekimeiya had only presented itself to the culprit after something had happened in here? That doesn't seem very logical to me. The logical assumption to me would be that the culprit knew of the Sekimeiya's powers to begin with and orchestrated this all from the start. Because if you think about it, then, for like a second the thought entered my mind, okay, maybe Erina saw Isla's dead body, she wanted to go back to the past before she was dead, but why would any of the other things that happened before then, why would they have happened? So the most reasonable assumption to me seems that the culprit wanted to use the Sekimeiya already before the whole game even started, which makes finding out whoever it could be difficult because, frankly, we know about the past of Atsuki and Shiraya, but about none of the other pasts, so we don't know any motives. Atsuki kind of, maybe has a motive, same as Shiraya, but with Atsuki we'd have sort of like an unreliable narrator trope, which I really like actually as kind of a trope in games and shows and stuff like that, but I doubt it. And Shiraya I definitely think is possible, but I still have my doubts. I think it's more likely that it's one of the others, although I wouldn't count out Shiraya yet. Sai had been who'd first presented the draft of the theory I was using. That the time the Sekimeiya spent outside of its cabinet was what determined the amount of time traveled. If that would be the fundamental motive of our extended imprisonment, Sai, who hadn't listened to the recording, was the strongest candidate to suspect. However, the recording had made it sound as if we'd been abandoned by the world outside, so blaming someone in the building instead might have been foolish. But the reality was that we were most likely still sharing space with a killer who had killed anywhere from 1 to 3 times. The death of the second Naomi had almost certainly been a normal homicide, but I wasn't sure if the case was the same with Isla. The culprit's actions had been linked to the Sekimeiya from the beginning, and they had managed to escape us so far. It was strange how they'd known straight away about the Sekimeiya's powers, and it had begun to seem like they might have come from the far future. Fair? Okay. Someone who comes from, like, not even beyond, like, the next month or so in the tower, but someone who comes from, like, years into the future is an interesting thought that I hadn't considered yet. it could have all been in process. All of us had learned about the Sekimeiya's powers, then someone had decided to trap us for an entire month and would actually accomplish it somehow. In the future, once the required time passed, they would travel back and exist at the start of the day's events with a full understanding of the Sekimeiya. They would cause what they'd once seen, which meant that at that moment, a future version of one of us existed somewhere. It was a bit paradoxical too, but depending on how they would replicate the events they'd experienced, it might have made sense. Yes, to an extent. The question would be how, I guess the paradoxical part about it would be, then there would be two of that person. We've seen a second side before, yes, but in theory, that would mean that one of the two, I say one of the two culprits, one of the two versions of the culprit would have to hide for an excruciatingly long time, and they would have to remember pretty much anything that had happened during that time, which would be extremely unreasonable to think that one would remember. And again, coming back to the second Psy, possible that that is the case and he just made a mistake. But actually, that would make even more sense in that scenario then, wouldn't it? Because the first Psy at that point, who is the Psy that is with us the whole time, had no clue what had gone on. So if the second Psy that we'd seen is actually someone from the far future, that would explain that situation. The question is then obviously, where the hell is he hiding the whole time? Because it seems ridiculous that he would remember every single place of every single person for a month. I recalled the first time I traveled to the past, when Shiraya hadn't realized that I'd been a future self of mine. Also, actually, good point there, that I just remembered. Sai would know most of the time where most of the people were, but Sai wouldn't exactly know where Asuki had traveled, at which point. Same goes for Shiraya, obviously, as well. But I also just remembered Sai mentioned back then up in the kind of attic that because Atsuki had now told him about it, Sai would know that and wouldn't forget about it. He wouldn't run into that situation. But as I said, with a month passing, who knows if he'd remember it? Obviously, if he remembers every other small detail, then it seems quite likely that he would remember this too. But, what if in one of the searches we'd found the culprit but hadn't known it? Could they have impersonated their past self at some point? That was my point. And yes, they could have. I might have been completely off, and without the recording's existence, my thoughts would have been vastly different. If it had been faked in order to mislead us, it had proven to be very effective. If we had to trust it though, the fact that who had traveled had brought the voice recorder with them was still very important. They must have had a solid reason to do that, and I wanted to believe one they'd thought of themselves. Not just because they'd previously experienced the reality in which the voice recorder had been brought. We wouldn't have food to survive, and there was no way Ashi and the police would abandon us. However, if the recording we'd heard would truly occur in the future, there was one last thing I had to think about. I believed that somehow it would be one of us who would trap everyone inside the tower for longer than we expected. While it sounded impossible, we possessed the Sekimeiya, which had powers we didn't know the extent of. It was likely that keeping the tower shut would be even harder from the outside. Inside, we had access to the computer that managed the security system. Altering the alarm's functions was well in reach. It wasn't that simple though. Even if one of us permanently locked the exit, the outside would have to get us out in less than a month, as it would become a life or death situation. They had said that blowing off the shutters wasn't viable, but there had to be something they could do if it came down to it. An underground passage, for example. There was no way shutters alone would keep us trapped for a month. And regarding the motive, I didn't think I was being unrealistic. It might have been to use the Sekimeiya in a specific way, and I couldn't think of anything else. That would confirm that the time traveled wasn't determined with a 1-to-1 ratio. If 10 stored minutes resulted in a travel of 10 minutes, storing more time or up to a month would be useless. No matter how much time the Sekimeiya spent outside of its cabinet, activating it would always send you to the point where time had begun to be stored. When I thought of that, I came to a pretty unsettling realization. If that wasn't some way the motive, after a month a lot of time would have been stored, and it was a given that at least 1 month would be travelled back. We'd reached a conclusion that the range was likely proportional to the time travelled, and that it most likely went through solid objects. If the range of a 40-minute travel had equaled to a sizable room, a 30-day one would surely reach far outside the tower. That would pick many people up, and they'd be sent back alongside the culprit who'd activated the Sekimeiya. Of course, there hadn't been any reports of many people having suddenly arrived from the future. The minutes kept passing, and the mutual silence wasn't broken. I continued going over the same thoughts, but ultimately we would have to wait to decide further on any theory. At the very least, considering all those options would prepare me for whatever would end up happening. I didn't reach any conclusion. Everything that came to mind I'd already thought of. Waiting like that only slowed our perception of time, but there was nothing else we could do. Shiria kept looking at her lap, breathing deeply every so often. Erina hadn't moved in a long time, and her knees hid her face from us. Sai's, Akro's, and Kate's expressions alternated between concern and thought, and they rarely lifted their heads. "30 minutes later. Ooh. We remained frozen like that for a long time, during which we all must have been thinking about Isla, Naomi, the Sekimeiya, and the culprits behind it all. The sound that resumed time's march came from one of us. We blankly faced it and saw Kate standing up, stretching his arms a little. "I'm going to the bathroom." With a faint but hoarse voice, showing that he hadn't cleared his throat in a while, he let us know his destination. Nobody responded to him, so he left through hallway A. We turned our gazes back down as if nothing had happened. What he'd just done could have been considered suspicious behavior, but nobody said anything. The Sekimeiya was in its unlocked cabinet. However, it was kept cold, and Shire and I were in possession of the other one. Kate wouldn't be able to activate it to go substantially back into the past. All he could do would be to move it, leaving himself as the only suspect. At least that was what I thought, until another sound reached our ears. "I'll go too. It's been a while." Without paying attention to our reactions, Sai stood up and left through hallway B, which he'd been closer to. All of a sudden, the two most suspicious people had gone off on their own, and they'd closed both doors behind them. It didn't change what I thought. They couldn't go back to the past. Shira and I looked at each other, but we decided to ignore them and wait. It was a little strange that Sai had left right after Kate. Perhaps he was still wary of him and wanted to see what he'd gone to do. I thought further on it. Was the possibility of one of them going considerably back to the past truly something I could rule out? If everything was as we thought, yes, I'd been the one to put the Sekimeiya in its cabinet, and at that moment I'd felt the cold temperature. After that, nobody had entered the room. It wouldn't have been possible for anyone to unplug the cabinet or take the Sekimeiya out later. Atsuki. You're making the mistake of assuming there are no second versions of anyone here. If anyone had already traveled to the past from the future and had been hiding somewhere, whatever, they could easily take the Sekimeiya out of its cabinet again and leave it to charge up while all... Is it still 7? Is it 6 now? Wait. Atsuki, Shiraya, Kate, Sai, Akaro, Erina. 6. Okay. While all 6 of you were in here. We remained on the floor waiting for Kate and Sai to come back as we kept every thought to ourselves. The atmosphere had suddenly become a lot more uneasy as soon as one of us had left. Akaro kept looking at the door Kate had disappeared through, showing slight doubt toward him. Erina, though, hadn't reacted to Sai's movements. 2 minutes passed without either of them returning. It was nothing alarming, but every second dragged on. I expected Kate to come back first, so as I stayed looking at the hallway A door, I considered how odd it was that he'd left through it. After more than 5 minutes, I began to worry. Actually, 1 second. True. You wouldn't expect to leave through hallway A if you wanted to go to the bathrooms. Is this white dot where we are currently, or is it something else? Because if it is where we are currently, then it's totally fair. I mean, whether you go this way or that way literally doesn't matter. If we are somewhere further to the right here or here or here, then going through A seems stupid, unnecessary. You could potentially argue, because both doors were closed, for someone with poor spatial awareness, someone who's maybe not too familiar with the layout of the tower, that they just forgotten which side the bathrooms were on, they'd forgotten which hallway is which, and they kind of just left through one of the doors and were like, ah, yeah. But Kata is supposed to be a security guard here. How would he forget which side of the hallway is behind which door, or which side of the hallway the bathrooms are on? That seems strange. True. Good point, Atsuki. I'd chosen not to pointlessly voice my suspicions because of Isla's death, but Sai and Kate might have purposely abused that. I'll see if I can find them. I stood up and directed myself toward hallway B. I didn't want to be the third person to leave suspiciously, so I only intended to check if I could see anyone next to the bathrooms. Before I could reach the doorknob, the opposite door opened. From behind came Kate, who quickly saw me and gave me a conspicuous frown. Okay, now that is interesting. It's one thing about exiting the room through that door, but entering it again from that door is now actually suspicious. Why would you purposely go the long way around? Kate, where are you going? To see if I could find you inside. Why did you take so long? I went to the bathroom, so that's not a very appropriate question. Did Sai go find me too? No, he said he'd also go to the bathroom. I see. That's also a very strange reply. This I see. Because obviously, you should realize if Sai went to the bathroom, I mean, he could have gone to the other bathroom. There's nothing wrong, there's 2 bathrooms. Maybe he didn't want to wait, he went into the other bathroom. Fair enough. Did you not see him? Also, forgive me for all these questions, but why did you leave and come back from hallway A if you went to the bathroom? Atsuki, do you not remember what's in the bathroom on this floor? I could have chosen to go to the women's, but I went to the one on floor 2 instead. That's likely why I didn't see Sai. Fair enough, good excuse. Alright. Perhaps I jumped the gun too quickly, even though Sai's long absence was still on my mind. He'd gone to a different bathroom, so he hadn't had to wait for it to become available. I resumed what I was doing and opened the hallway B door. I saw it devoid of anyone and with every door closed, including the bathrooms in the distance. I don't see anyone. It's been almost 10 minutes, so I'll try to find them. Before I could leave, Shiria stood up and came to me. I'll help you. I can't just keep sitting here. Alright, we shouldn't take too long. As Sai had done, we closed the door behind us. Why would you do that? I knew Shiria had spent plenty of time silently mourning our loss, so I understood her. Repeating it was unbearable, and I needed to occupy myself with something after sitting for so long. She also must have agreed that Sai's behavior was off. He'd even openly accused her earlier, so her impression of him had to be poor. Let's check the event room first. We headed there and verified that the Sekimeiya was still present. I looked behind the cabinet and saw the cord plugged into the outlet too. Next we moved to the bathrooms. Although the doors were closed, neither one was locked and Sai wasn't inside. It looks like he really took this chance to do something. If he went to a bathroom above, Kate would have seen him. Not true. Definitely not true. I feel like he might have gone to search for the Sekimeiya that we have. It was the one he hid in the cleaning room. Yeah, it's possible. He's probably somewhere on this floor. Beginning with the hallway B rooms, we kept opening every door and briefly searching for him. We'd learned already which cabinets had interiors large enough to contain a person, and after what had happened to Isla, checking them was less due to routine and more so necessity. We decided that there was no purpose in checking the Sekimeiya in Naomi's locker since we could have been seen. We didn't want to move it or activate it, and it was possible it wasn't working anyway. Shira sounded hesitant about the decision, but I also hadn't abandoned the thought of using it later too. At the very least, try to find out what had happened to Isla. We entered the room, made sure it was empty, and moved on to the next one. As I was checking the cabinets in the room where we'd found the first Naomi, the interior of one of them immediately let me know something about it was different. Upon unlocking it and opening its cover, a frigid burst of air hit my face. Ate had stated that room contained the cabinets with temperature regulation functions. However, the previous times we'd opened them, no special temperature had been set. Shiraya noticed my reaction and came to see if anything was wrong. After feeling the cold air that had begun to diffuse through the room, she checked the wheel on the right side of the cabinet. It's set to 0 degrees Celsius. It had to have been changed recently. There's nothing inside, so that's pretty strange. It was a different cabinet than the one I had first traveled from, and I wasn't sure why it would be done since the Sekimeiya hadn't been put inside. When we got the locker key from Naomi, it might have already been like this, so we can't just suspect Sai and Kate. Yeah, and we can't blindly believe Sai's story either. Regardless, whoever did this didn't let the others know, so we should probably revert the temperature. Yeah, the culprit might count on this cabinet for later if they change the temperature in preparation. If I switch the wheel to room temperature, we should be able to close the lid. I nodded and she did so before we left the room. It wasn't clear if setting it to room temperature would make the inside of the cabinet match the outside, or if it would only stop the rate. It's gonna make the outside of the room 0 degrees too. But leaving the lid open to not preserve the existing cold could have alerted the culprit that their measures had been reversed. We proceeded to the other rooms and resumed the search. We didn't want to waste much time or we'd become the suspicious ones. As soon as hallway B was done, we began with the parallel hallway. The first room we entered was the storeroom. Continuing with our backward order, it was one of the smallest rooms on the entire floor, and its purpose was still a bit unclear as it wasn't storing anything that could have been used in the future. Given how small it was, we should have left it immediately, but Shiraya noticed something that prolonged our stay. Wait, come here, look at this part of the wall. Shiraya had gone to the end of the dimly lit room, was pointing her finger at the place she wanted me to see. I stepped in, making my way through the cluttered narrow space. Then I looked beyond her finger, faintly illuminated by the single light. It took me a while to understand what she meant. She was pointing at the left corner, and after glancing up and down in search of anything out of place, I finally noticed the oddity she'd found. Huh, how did you even notice this? The wall was dirty and uneven, giving away its old age. You could still see the outline of a grid that separated the wall into tiny squares. They were all defined by white lines that had started to fade with time. On one of the squares that made contact with the left wall, Shiraya had seen the slight lack of dust which was otherwise present over every surface of the room. Even though the poor illumination made it hard to see, what seemed to be fingerprints existed on it. Not only that, but its close surroundings were a bit cleaner than the rest of the walls. From the door I saw this area reflecting the hallway's tea light a lot more. I don't know when, but it looks like someone touched this corner. I suppose so. But I doubt it means anything, and we can't even be sure it happened today. Hold on. These fingerprints, it's hard to see, but they're not vertical, right? Yeah, they look horizontal. You won't touch any wall with 3 fingers in this horizontal position accidentally. I wouldn't think so. Just touching it would leave them vertical and more separated. I shaped my hand to match the 3 fingerprints and placed it over them. My arm formed a right angle with the left wall, but it didn't make me understand the meaning of what we found. I have no idea why I'd ever touch a corner of a room like this. There's nothing important in this room either. Huh? What? As I removed my hand from the wall, I felt something. Did something happen? When I took away my hand, it seemed as if the square moved a bit. I didn't see anything. I pressed my fingers on the square again. Instead of pulling away, I moved my hand around, and as I'd thought, it was a bit loose. You're right, it's moving a little. It didn't go anywhere though. I could only move it sideways and it wouldn't get detached from the wall. This must be why someone touched the spot, but it's not doing anything. Will it move any more than that? It was sliding side to side almost imperceptibly. Realizing that I hadn't been applying enough force, I attempted to move it past its seeming limits. All of a sudden, as if it were a door, the wall opened, revealing a hidden space behind.